If you're a ministry leader out there and you're feeling discouraged, you're feeling tired, we love to come alongside you and help you and to encourage you and to remind you you have the greatest mission on the planet and to bring you best practices and help you find those little wins.
Welcome to the Post-Christian Podcast, where we help you make disciples in our increasingly post-Christian world. My name is Eric Bryant. I'm the campus pastor at Gateway in South Austin and Gateway Austin Online. I'm also the founder of Catalyzing Community. Sign up for our email newsletter at ericbryant.org and we'll send you free resources. On today's episode of the Post-Christian Podcast, I'm here with Amy Anderson. How are you doing, Amy?
I'm doing great. It's so nice to be on this podcast with you.
Well, it's great to have you. I have been so impressed as you have stepped in, taking on so much more at the Unstuck Group. We really miss Tony Morgan, have loved all that you guys have done. You've been there for many, many years. But if you don't mind, as we start this new year, look towards the past, maybe share a little bit about what the fall of 2024 was like for you and the Unstuck Group, and how you've seen God really guide the Unstuck Group in the midst of the loss of Tony Morgan.
Yeah, it was so shocking, Eric. This past year was just honestly a banner year. We were serving so many churches. I was so busy. In fact, my last conversation with Tony, he kind of leaned in on a Zoom call we were on Friday afternoon, and he said, "Hey, my discernment's just kicking in. And are you okay? It seems like maybe this is just a job." And I said, "Oh gosh, no, your discernment's good as always." He was such a discerning guy. I said, let me give you an analogy, Tony. And I said, back when my husband and I would run together, if Jason was 3 inches behind me, I could run forever. I felt like I was winning, didn't worry about anything, felt strong, proud of myself. But if he even inched up an inch or two in front of me, all of a sudden I felt like I couldn't keep up. I couldn't breathe. I was losing. I wanted to quit. I said, with all the churches we have served this past year, I said, I just feel like Unstuck's about 3 inches in front of me right now. So no, I'm good. I have a vacation booked. I'm just trying to keep up with it. And then he, of course, in Tony's style, just lauded me with appreciation, such kind words. And little did I know it'd be our last conversation. So,
wow.
This year, it's really interesting. We kind of experienced a shift in who we were serving. Actually, we've been serving many of our churches for years, meaning they stay on with us in implementation. So in some regards, we were just celebrating the fruition of all their work. I think sometimes people think they bring in, a consulting group or whatnot. We meet, 3 or 4 times over 3 months, and now they're in their new normal. It's not that way at all. In fact, my colleague Chad Hunt calls it, that's the hair on fire year, where you're trying to figure everything out, get your work organized, all of that. But our church has just started experiencing tremendous growth. In fact, we do some cohorts throughout the year with executive pastors and multi-site churches. And I had 3 of them back to back because we had to reschedule them after losing Tony. And it was just like, we have to add a service. We're adding a location. We grew by 30%. We grew by 40%, like all these stories of growth. So it was just honestly all sunshine. It was a lot of hard work. But we just saw God, his hand on our team, his hand on the churches that we were able to serve. So yeah, losing Tony was quite unexpected and a shift. He had no family history, really out of the blue. But since then, what Tony was a master team builder. If you ever worked with him, he was all about diversity of gifts, building a team that complemented one another. And so Sean and Tiffany and I just kind of rose up into our lanes. It is our strong desire to carry this mission forward. It was never meant to die with Tony. Tony and I, in fact, we're the same age. We were planning retirement at the same time. We were talking about our successors, and we had such a great plan, Eric. and then we didn't. So our mission now, the Unstuck's mission, is just to help churches get and stay unstuck. Our deep prayer is just to continue this ministry. And I don't know what it'll look like 2 years from now, who the new face of it will be. But for now, we're just going to stay obedient and carry it through.
Well, your work together has made a real difference. We've had the Unstuck Group a part of what we're doing here at Gateway in Austin. But even since then, the webinars, the continued research you put out on the reports.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're such a gift as a team to the body of Christ, to the Big C Church. Maybe share with us a little bit about some of the things you saw in these churches that were no longer stuck. Why
Mm-hmm.
for many 2024 was a good year. What were some of the common themes you saw in how God was at work in these churches?
Yeah, of course. If people listen to our podcast, we talk about it all the time. These were churches that just paused and said, let's get in a room for a couple of days and really seek the Lord's direction and understand what is it that we're good at? What are the things that we maybe need to improve? And then put a plan together to actually do that and then get our structure aligned to it. And, it's so rare. You're in ministry. Ministry is a whirlwind, and we have 52 events every year. It's nonstop. Sunday's always coming. And one of the biggest benefits that I see when we work with the church is leaders pause and they get in a room and they think together. And you probably know it, if someone would ask you, what do we need to work on? Where do we need to put our energies? But when you harness a team of 8 to 12 people to really put plans together and they actually work those plans, that's the magic of it all. You will never get a 3-ring notebook from Unstuck. We are not about notebooks. We're about action. And really, at the end of the day, our heart is that we want churches to get unstuck. It actually makes us mad if churches don't implement, because they just paid this money to put their plan together, but a plan doesn't do anything. Working it does. My colleague Paul Alexander from Sun Valley, they go through the Unstuck process every year. He facilitates it now because he's one of our consultants. But he says it's a strategic obedience every year
Mm,
to continue to refresh their plan and then work their plan. Even through COVID, they were launching locations, they were growing, they were baptizing so many
mm,
people, but it's because they had a plan and they just continued to work it. And so that was a big part. That was a big part, I think, of all these churches' success building off it. But there's some type of revival, I think, Eric, too. I think people
yeah.
are, we talked about the nuns for so many years or the people who were de-churched and came back. I just think with our Gen Z and millennials, God's doing something in creating uh, a new interest, a new curiosity. And honestly, the churches that are ready for new people, when they're thinking about those people who are far from God and outside the faith, and they're recognizing their weekend service is really their main strategy for most churches to reach them. When they're ready, people are sticking because
Yeah.
that's what God does.
Yeah. We've had something so unusual happen the last several weeks. We've had two different people who showed up for their very first Sunday wanting to be baptized. And
Wow.
they had been watching YouTube, live our services and doing their own search online and
Mm-hmm.
came having already given their life to Christ and ready to get baptized. And what's really beautiful is the first guy hosted the baptism of the second woman, the second one that came up at his house,
Oh my
and then we
goodness.
just baptized a third person at his house. So we baptized him and two others just in the last few weeks. So there is something that God is doing for sure in the midst of the tumultuousness. Your unstuck process, I want to talk about that for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of what you said of when I was in Los Angeles at Mosaic. And every year or so, Erwin would pull us together as a staff and say, okay, we've got a core group of 2,000 people. We've got $2 million that we can spend. What are we going to do this year?
Mm-hmm.
Now, he liked to consider, himself and our church kind of part of the R&D department in the Big C Church. So I don't necessarily recommend a new strategy every single year,
Right.
but talk about your unstuck process that you help churches go through, because it sounds like it's obviously been a big help to us and to many others.
Yeah. So there's 3 components of it. And the first one we just call a ministry health assessment. And the wisdom in that part of the process is we're going to spend a day together before we start planning to really assess our ministry. Again, to pause, to get in a room, talk about what are our strengths, what are we doing well, what are those things that, man, we need to optimize that. What are the things that feel stuck? What are the
Mm,
things that we think needs to change? What are the things that maybe we're not doing right now that we need to consider doing? And what are the things that we maybe have a little bit of confusion around, which could be things like, how are we going to address growth? Are we going to plant churches? Are we going multi site? Or it could just be ministry specific. And what I love about that part of the engagement is we put a month between that visit and the next one. And what I see is that people have this antenna up they didn't have up before. They're starting to see things and think about things differently. We also train them, by the way, how to secret shop their services so that they can, try to look at their church with fresh eyes. But I liken it to when my husband and I, when we bought our maroon Honda CRV. That was the car we ended up buying several years ago. I had never seen one on the road before, but after the purchasing process, they were everywhere, especially at Costco. And it's like that. This antenna goes up after you've had those conversations, you start to see things differently. And by the time you get to planning, I think God's done a work in their hearts to go, these are the priorities we need to talk about. So then we move into, now that we know where we are, what our starting line is, where is God calling us to go? And I love what you just said. When you said Erwin would say, we've got $2 million, what are we going to do? Every lead pastor should know how to answer that. And that starts in the planning process. We start with the vision piece of just, where's God calling your church to go over the next 3 to 5 years? Every pastor has to know, like, these are our dreams. If we weren't afraid, if the roadblocks that maybe we sense are out there weren't there, what would God do through our church? And then put the plan together to go, not only that, but then what does success look like this year for us? What are we trusting God to do through our church? And now, do we have the right ministry strategies? Which gets into your R&D thing. So back when I was working at Eaglebrook, my first year there, we were probably about 2,000 people. And we had a mid-size group strategy, which meant we had three groups, 100 people each, but they were all full. And we tried to replicate that. We didn't have any space left at our church, Eric. We had very limited space, but it seemed to be a good strategy. So we started busing people to a hotel down the street, all this kind of stuff. Anyways, we couldn't replicate it. So we made a strategy change to do small groups. And of course, that's so common now, but back then that was kind of a new thing to have small groups. And those 300 people wanted to leave our church because they thought we only cared about new people and not believers. But we were like, no, we've got 300 and getting smaller groups around the Bible, but there's 1,700 who have no option. So we made a strategy change. So we kind of knew if we were believing God that 1,000 people, say 50% of our church, should be in a smaller group around the Bible this year, our current strategy was only going to afford us 300. So we had to do a strategy change. So we always talk about results and goals first, then look at our strategies. Then the third visit is all about now aligning staffing and structure to those ministry priorities. And, I come out of a corporate background. I was there for 10 years before I went into ministry. But it's amazing. Pastors really don't get any training in organizational leadership. And sometimes when I'm doing these engagements, someone will inevitably say, are we a business or are we a church? And I often say, you're just an organization, and organizational principles transcend whether you're a for-profit, not-for-profit ministry. So it's just so helpful, especially on the staffing side, because pastors need a fresh look at their team. They need to understand the strengths of their team members, where there's some gaps, where people have hit leadership leads, because often they're just a little bit too close to it. So that's our standard process. Now, when we help a multi-site church or a church that wants to go multi-site, it still follows that cadence of kind of assessment, planning, and staffing and structure. But our multi-site process, which so many people were engaged in this year, their expansion strategies, we developed this probably 7 years ago so that churches didn't have to pay the stupid tax anymore. Meaning, multi-site has been around long enough that we know the predictable outcomes of strategy decisions. So we just wanted to go in full disclosure. Here is, if you choose this strategy, this will most likely be your destination. If you choose this one will. So whether that's just how big of a team do we launch, what are kind of success factors for locations, those types of things are all built into our process. So we did a lot of that this past year as well. So those are kind of the core offerings that we work with churches on. And then, of course, we do these cohorts where we gather executive pastors and multi-site leaders to go through content kind of more in a group format. So they get to build relationships, kind of build their own tribe within the tribe, and walk with them for a year.
Well, I love what you're doing. Again, our church here with Carlos Ortiz and the executive team really enjoyed our time with Tony and are continuing to learn from you all. We're going to give away copies of The Unstuck Church by Tony
Yes.
Morgan. To those who sign up for my email newsletter, you'll have a chance to win at ericbryant.org. And I want to encourage all of you to go to the unstuckgroup.com. There's some great resources, free resources, multi-site toolkit, the church report that you guys have,
Mm-hmm.
so many others. You know, your husband's a lead pastor. You are
Mm-hmm.
in ministry at a church. You're still in ministry now at the Unstuck Group. For those who are discouraged, for those who have been in ministry for a while and maybe are feeling stuck, what sort of encouragement do you have for pastors and church leaders that are really not up and to the right currently
Yeah.
and maybe a bit discouraged?
Yeah. Boy, I think ministry, especially for a lot of our non denominational churches that aren't part of a mainline type of denomination, it can get really lonely and it's a battle, right? We have an enemy. It's a battle. It never ends. It's very relentless. So I completely understand the feelings that pastors get. And actually, that's a little bit of why we do what we do as well. In fact, we have 8 or 9 statements that talk about what kind of defines our culture. And the very first one on the list is that we want to bring hope.
Mm.
If you're a ministry leader out there and you're feeling discouraged, you're feeling tired, we love to come alongside you and help you and to encourage you and to remind you have the greatest mission on the planet and to bring you best practices and help you find those little wins. We kind of have to create our own start lines and finish lines in ministry. So, one of the things I would probably say, going back to my opening story, create a finish line for yourself so that you can kind of put it down and pick it back up. Make sure you celebrate and look back. Sometimes we're just so busy moving forward that we don't really pause and get a chance to see what God's doing. Just an example, I had a voicemail yesterday. It was a text voicemail, so it disappeared after I listened to it, which I was really bummed about. But it was a lead pastor we had worked with on their multi-site process. And their launch, it was their third location. Just so many challenges getting that opened in a temporary school location. They didn't have the numbers they wanted. And anyways, they've just kept their hands on the plow and they kept working at it. Tony and I both worked with this church. And the voicemail concluded with, so I just wanted to let you know, in a school in our, this town in Delaware, we had 329 people show up this weekend. And that was up from 100 when they were just in kind of the throes and the challenges of trying to crack this nut. And of course, he said, I wanted to call Tony. And then I remembered. So I called you. And I want you to know that we're so grateful of where God's led our church through the hard work. So
Yeah.
don't quit in those valleys. In fact, the worst time to quit is when you're in a valley. If you're going to
Mm.
quit at a high point because then you're sober minded with it. Um,
Yeah.
I think the last thing I would say is I think every leader, certainly the lead pastor, executive pastors, but even leaders over ministries, to stay in it long term, we have to be both high performing and healthy. And I think that in ministry, we can tip one way or the other. We can lean too much towards results, get her done, growth, this, that, and the other. But some churches actually lean too much towards health. And so they love each other and they're taking their Sabbath and happy, but they both have downsides too, right? Right. Just going after performance, you can lose your soul doing ministry. But just going after health, we probably aren't getting a lot done. So even to step back and just evaluate, what are my rhythms like? Am I in my spiritual disciplines? How's the performance of my team? Because the answer to those questions kind of will drive you. Which way do I need to go? Where do I need
Mm.
to make that investment? We'll never find balance. Balance isn't probably the goal, but we don't want it so skewed that our ministry or our lives get a little too messed up.
Yeah, that's so well said. You know, as you were speaking, it reminded me of a quote from Rosabeth Moss Cantor out of the Harvard Business School.
Mm.
She said, everything looks like failure in the middle. So
Oh,
don't
yeah.
give up in the middle. You could be right on the edge of that breakthrough. And then our founding
Mm-hmm.
pastor once said, if you need hope, borrow it from someone else. And
Yes.
so that's John Burke. Thank you, Amy, for sharing your hope with us and with so many
Mm-hmm.
other churches. Keep up your great work there at the Unstuck Group. We're really grateful for you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on the Post Christian Podcast. More resources available at ericbryant.org.